Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Tillman.
Hi, I'm Jess Jolly.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Koziel.
And I'm Matthew Harvey. Today, our group is going to be talking about how society stifles the marginalized. The two texts that we decided to look at are Phyllis Wheatley's original poetry and then Jeffers' response to that in The Age of Phyllis. So our topic in a nutshell is that we wanted to look at Phyllis Wheatley's poetry from her forced enslavement and examine how her works respond to the people who oppressed her. We also wanted to examine how Jeffers' The Age of Phyllis works as a modern interpretation and how it looks to recreate Wheatley's life. We take a look at how each one adds to our understanding of how the marginalized is stifled, and then how the original and more modern works respond to oppression. And we pay special attention to similarities and differences. We also look at how this has been a ripple effect into today's Black Lives Matter movement later on. So our three critical questions throughout the project and kind of guided our thinking is, one, in what ways does society stifle the marginalized? How do they do it? Number two being, what is the impact of the stifling? How does it affect the marginalized, and how does it help enforce the oppression? And then how do the marginalized respond to being stifled? Do the two that we look at respond similarly, or do they respond differently from each other?
So for our analysis, we discussed how the dominant society stifles the marginalized in distinct ways. The first is throwing scripture or law at them. The dominant society twists the scripture and the law to fit their needs and also use those two to take agency from the marginalized. The overall impact of the stifling is that the dominant society is able to keep control, which is their whole goal. The reason they stifle the marginalized is because they fear they will lose the control they have, and by stifling them, they're able to keep firm hold on that control and avoid a revolt. The effect on the marginalized is that they are unable to gain agency and a big enough following to not only overthrow the dominant society, but to just have basic human rights. So to continue on that analysis, the marginalized typically respond by fighting back in an elegant way. It is never in the quote-unquote savage ways that society makes them out to be, but usually is in a way that outsmarts them. In this case of Phyllis Wheatley, we see Phyllis not really fight back, but use her skills to her advantage. Phyllis outsmarts them by being more than they think she is capable of. By defying the expectations they set for her, Jeffers instead fights back with her interpretation by including sections that Wheatley might have thought while writing to the leaders of the patriarchy.
And this is the example we go off of what Jess said. So the first one is an excerpt from Phyllis Wheatley's actual writing, where she says, "Sir, I have taken the freedom to address you, Excellency, in the enclosed poem and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies. Your being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to the Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the frame of your virtues, excites sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon the attempt. Wishing your Excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am your Excellency's most obedient, humble servant." And then the next fragment we have is taken from Jeffers' work, where she responds directly to this excerpt from Phyllis Wheatley. So she takes out the entirety of the beginning, where she addresses him as sir and uses a bunch of proper nouns to refer to a colonizing force. And she says, "To address your Excellency, depending on his moods or money in the enclosed poem, and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible of your Excellency's most obedient servant." So what we gain from this and how this is a direct analysis is that Jeffers takes the vocality that Phyllis was unable to express and states what she believes that Phyllis was thinking. Phyllis was an enslaved person, so she was unable to say a lot of the claims she might have had against white oppressors because she would have directly been negatively impacted by her transgression. So Jeffers takes it on herself to reinvert the narrative of Wheatley and make her as an active agent against colonialism, racism, and colonization.
So we also decided to take a look at Thomas Jefferson's critique of Wheatley's poetry, which he published in his Notes on the State of Virginia in 1784. So he starts off by saying, but never yet could I find that a Black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never see even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. Misery is often the parent of most affecting touches in poetry. Among the Blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. The heroes of the Dunciad are to her as Hercules to the author of that poem. So his critiques are really just based on racism and misogyny, and it seems really ironic that he says that Phyllis's poetry is not worth even being criticized, and yet he's still here criticizing it. Apparently it is, because that's what this whole section is about. I also find it really ironic that he seems to think that Black people are not capable of the same amount of intelligence as white people, and yet he still spells her name completely wrong. I think he was so upset by this poetry because her work challenged the pervasive racist stereotypes that were part of popular public opinion at the time. Her existence by itself was transgressive to the patriarchal white narrative because she proved the stereotypes wrong very publicly by publishing her poetry. So Jefferson and other critics of Wheatley felt the need to dig their heels in about racism so that they could keep justifying slavery. So the big takeaway from looking at Phyllis's original work and the recreation that Jeffers does is that the new texts add to the conversations of the marginalized being stifled. Like Lindsay mentioned earlier, Phyllis may not have had the ability to speak out, at least in a very explicit way, because of how she was literally enslaved at the time. It would not have really been safe for her to do so. So therefore, in her original work, you don't really get to see her true feelings about her situation. So Jeffers' insight helps to sort of fill in those gaps, or at least what she believes would be in those gaps. So we get a new perspective on what could have been going through Phyllis's head as she was writing this poetry, since we don't have the opportunity to do that.
And segueing into a more modern and English interpretation of the work of Jeffers and Phyllis, I talk about the lost vocality of Black voices. And I want to preface this by saying I am a white person and we are all white people in this group. So my take may be valuable, it may not be, but ultimately I don't have the lived experience to back that. So although the narrative collection of the poetry of the Age of Phyllis by Honoria Fanony Jeffers adds a sense of completion and wholeness to the life and poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, the unbridled vocality of Phyllis Wheatley is forever lost to modern society due to the forces of colonialism and patriarchy. So what I mean by this is that even though Jeffers adds what Phyllis might have been thinking, we still don't know. We still don't ultimately know because of the rampant way that colonialism, colonization, and racism dominate voices for people of color. That vocality is forever lost. It does not matter if Jeffers is a Black woman now or has a similar lived experience. Ultimately, we can't go back and see what Phyllis was thinking. We don't know if she meant to address white people as Your Excellency, which, I mean, we would hope and assume that she is actually a transgressive force, but also Black bodies don't owe us the agency of being transgressive forces. They exist, and that's all. And secondly, although Jeffers is a Black woman and minorities often experience similar types of oppression, Jeffers is still another individual that speaks over and morphs the voice of Phyllis Wheatley. So what I mean by this is not a critique of Jeffers in a sense, but we have a lot of people that, like us, like English majors, that like to interpret work that we don't know what was going on in the mind of those people. Lived experience does not equal or denote actual present thoughts and constructs that Phyllis Wheatley was experiencing. And even though Jeffers experiences the fallout in her life of colonialism and racist notions, she was not present in the situations that Phyllis Wheatley was. Therefore, she represents another voice that is ultimately speaking over Wheatley. And we've already had white individuals doing that. And the fact that Wheatley even had to go through white people to have her work published. And now we have another individual who is adding on and adding a different perspective that may or may not be relevant. But overall, the history of oppression cannot be undone, and the agency of Phyllis Wheatley was permanently eradicated due to enslavement. So ultimately, it doesn't matter so much what Jeffers is trying to do or my opinion of it, but it matters that white forces and colonialism and racist notions have eradicated the presence of Black bodies throughout history. And Phyllis Wheatley is just one example of that. And we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure if Jeffers is completely correct in what she says about Phyllis Wheatley, and we don't know if Phyllis Wheatley's words should be taken satirically or literally. But what we should do, because we are white people in this group, is seek more awareness, try to invert the things that we do today to be more inclusive and to be more mindful. And we should do our best to be advocates of activism against racist and colonial forces.
So one thing we found that was very interesting is a poem by Phyllis Wheatley titled Black Lives Matter. And you can find it on page 133 of Honoré Jeffers' collection. This was published in Boston circa 1765, and it reads, "Scattered kin, men auctioned by British sires, bully tendrils of power, reaching down for centuries. They arrive to acquire native lands and spill that blood for the crown. British stalking the foreign streets, choke, rough up those who misbehave, who dare to meet soldiers' eyes, decry monarchy, resist. The Americans fight back, begin to greet redcoats with sneers, in tracts call themselves slaves. Insist they're tethered, yet the Africans, the many sold, the wretched, the taken, who move from human to trafficked, are ignored as white men don paper chains, the language of wounded throats, chatteled claims."
So segueing off of a discussion about how Black Lives Matter and the history of colonial oppression from British forces as well as American forces, we still have this issue occurring today. The Black Lives Matter movement is something that everyone should be aware of. It's been in the media, although it has not been covered well in the media, and it is surrounding our culture currently. And there's a reason for that. And ultimately, we need to listen up to Black voices when they're saying, hey, our lives still don't matter. And there's a reason behind that, because colonialism and racism are still constructs that affect and segregate communities today and end up killing the lives of young Black people who never get a chance to fully live. We have people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor who were killed now by cops. And what are cops morphed into now but another agent of colonialism in a sense? They are no better than the British. They are no better than white slaveholders in the past. And that is not a political claim. That's a claim against an agency that is using their power to manipulate and deteriorate the lives of other people. And ultimately, it's not up to political debate. We need to listen to the vocality of Black people, because even just the recent arrest of the middle picture, who is Derek Chauvin, who took the life of George Floyd, that, you know, we have white people screaming justice, justice, justice. No, this isn't justice. This is something that should have been done, that should have never taken this long to actually get him enslaved. And yes, Jess.
Sorry, I think we should mention it's kind of a token statement at this point that white people are the ones who tried and found him guilty, and white people are the ones who are going to say that this is justice.
Yes, and going off of what Jess said, that's the entire critique of the police force that have now become an agent like the British or an agent like white slaveholders. White people still have the power in our government currently. We are no better than we were histories ago when we were normalizing killing Black people. We're still normalizing killing Black people. And ultimately, white people still have the power to make decisions about what white people do to Black bodies. Therefore, we are actively erasing the lives of Black people from existence, from their voices and speech, from their mannerisms to their habits to just them being allowed to live. We don't even afford them that, because now Black people have to worry every time they come in contact to a police officer or any governmental official that is an agent of colonialism.
So we had the idea to sort of make the presentation a little more multimodal by creating this poster, which is sort of based on like the Western wanted posters that shows like the big bad criminals and how much money you can get if you bring them in dead or alive. So that's sort of what this was inspired by. But so here I've listed what Phyllis Wheatley's crimes against the patriarchy were. So I said Phyllis Wheatley is guilty of lashing out at white colonialism, challenging racist stereotypes, and maintaining agency through poetry. I just thought that this would be an interesting way to sort of illustrate, I guess, the reasons that her life was transgressive to the patriarchal forces, that, you know, these were all of the reasons that they felt the need to sort of downplay her work, even though they were publishing it. There was a lot of confusing, like differing voices at the time saying like, wow, it's really great that Phyllis published this, but also give her some slack because she's just a slave. So anyway, that's just sort of what the point of this poster was.
And ultimately, this is our works cited for the 2 books that we talk about. But I just wanted to leave off on a message that transgression is something that should be continued and revered. That is ultimately the point of our entire PowerPoint, and that just existing as a minority body is enough to be transgressive. It does not have to be necessarily poetry like Phyllis Wheatley or a reinterpretation of a narrative that you feel like has been erased in the point of Jefferson. I mean, sorry, not Jefferson. But ultimately, transgression comes as existing as a minority that the dominant force does not want to be there and to be present. And whether or not these minorities speak out does not take away from their active transgression as somebody living under white colonialism, the past of slavery, and under racist notions that still dominate and dictate many people's lives, unfortunately, in this country and many others. So transgression ultimately is existence as a whole. And we thank you for joining us, for listening to our presentation, and we hope that you all got something out of it about transgression, and we've thoroughly enjoyed doing this project together.